There's a story that Jesus told in the Bible, and it's called the parable of the lost son. It's actually even called the prodigal son. And it's a story that's so well known that people that don't even know a lot about the Bible at all would know something of that story. How someone was lost and then they were found. And so there's a story like that, and maybe today you have a story similar to that, where you reached the end of your rope and you found that you just wanted to find out. Someone told you about Jesus and you thought, wow, I've got to come in. I've got to come home. I want to come home. Maybe that's a story that you have, or perhaps today you don't even know Jesus, and you don't understand what I'm talking about, but there is a journey that we take when we become Christians where we want to just go home and we want to find the love of God. And that is a similar situation for all of us, because maybe you didn't sin as much as I did, or maybe you sin more, but it doesn't matter how much you sinned. We all sin. We all have sin in our life. There's always something that, because our forefathers, Adam and Eve, mucked it up and they decided to be disobedient. And so therefore, it has gone down through all of us. And so we've all sinned. And in a sense that we all need to come home because we're lost sons and daughters. And so today, I want to look at the story of the prodigal son and see what we can discover about the heart of God, about the attributes that are in the heart of God. That is our quest today. That's our destination. So before we start, we maybe need a definition of prodigal, because prodigal is an old word that we don't use anymore. I think it's an English word, but it means wastefully extravagant, giving on a lavish scale. Now, I know some women like that who can abuse a credit card as good as anybody. Wastefully extravagant. But it means more than that, wastefully extravagant. But let's move into the story and see what we can learn about the nature of God. So we begin our story in Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 15. And there's 3 stories in the Gospel of Luke, in chapter 15. And one is about the lost sheep. A shepherd loses one of his 100 sheep, and he goes to look for that sheep, and he finds him, and he rejoices. The second story is about a woman with 10 silver coins, and she loses one of those silver coins, and she searches diligently until she finds that coin, and she rejoices when she finds that coin. And the common phrase at the end is that God rejoices over one sinner who repents. Now, repent is another old-fashioned word that if you're new to all of this, you may not understand. But what it is that you are walking one way, maybe away from God, and then you turn around 180 degrees and you walk the other way towards God. So it's a turning around of you were going one way and then moving another. And what causes the joy in God's heart? It's just one sinner who repents. Just one. And God's got joy going on in his heart. Now, as we look at the parable of the lost son, it's important that we know who Jesus was talking to, who the audience was. You see, as you read the Bible sometimes and you take a surface look at these stories of Jesus, these parables, you think, well, that's a pretty cool story, rah, 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 and you just, gloss over it a little bit. But when you know exactly who he's talking to, it starts to take on new meaning, because sometimes his parables were a bit pointy towards certain groups. Now, there were 3 groups mentioned at the start of Luke chapter 15. 3 groups mentioned. There was tax collectors. They weren't generally loved because they took your money. So tax collectors. There were sinners. That's a pretty big group. But there were also Pharisees. Now, Pharisees were the religious leaders of the day. They didn't love Jesus because Jesus was getting a bit of a following, and they liked to control the situation, and they liked to have the control over the people, and they weren't happy with Jesus. And so the Pharisees kind of put sinners in different categories, and so there was really bad sinners. And it turns out that Jesus was associating with these really bad sinners. And so they wanted to discredit Jesus, and they were muttering to themselves, oh, he goes and eats with these sinners. How could he? And so that's the situation when we start to get into this parable. That's the situation. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start, and we'll start going through this. And so here's the first verse. Jesus continued. So he continued on from the previous parable. Jesus continued. There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So here was a self-entitled young man who just wanted to take what he could. And this request was actually a slap in the face to the father. There was no respect. There was no love. In fact, there was no relationship between the son and the father. And what he was actually saying here by asking for that request, give me my share, he's saying, well, Dad, you're as good as dead to me, and I'm getting out of here, and I'm going on a journey, and I want the money, and I want it now. A serious slap in the face for the father, and the father could have had him punished for this request. But the father in this story is a mirror image of the Father in heaven. And so the father gave him his request because we have free will. And so the father divided up the inheritance. So he divided up his property. Let's have a look at the next verse. He divided up the property between them, and not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, and he set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. So according to the law in Deuteronomy, the youngest son would have received 1/3, and the older son received 2/3. That's how it worked. And so the youngest son needed the cash, so he probably just put it up for a fire sale, adding more insult to the father, adding more shame to the family. And so the older son, he got his 2/3. And probably the person who bought the 1/3 of the estate would have had to wait until the father passed to get it. But when that happened, he would have added it to his estate and given it to his sons and so forth. And so the youngest son decided he was going to take off. And so in verse 12 it says, he divided the property between them, and the youngest son got together and he went to a distant country and there squandered his wealth in wild living. So when he got to that distant country, he would have been the man about town with a fat wallet, and a lot of people would have been hanging off him thinking, yeah, I'll have a piece of this. This is good. And so it was all good for a season until after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. Now, in those days, a severe famine was catastrophic. It meant that people were starving to death. It meant that they were finding ways to find food that just weren't right. And it was a tough season. And when you get down because of your own bad choices, it's one thing. But if you add a catastrophe like a famine to it, this guy was really in trouble now. So in verse 15, it says, "So he hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything." Now, according to Moses' law, pigs were unclean. Unclean animals. In fact, Jews wouldn't even touch the pigs. But he was down there with the pigs, handling the pigs, and getting into the trough and trying to eat the stuff that the pigs were eating. It's difficult to describe how far this young man had fallen, but he was down there. And he was getting lower by the minute. But here comes a turning point. In verse 17, when he came to his senses. And mums, if you're praying, mums, and your kids are away, and even dads, this is one thing you want to pray, that they come to their senses. And I think my mum would have been praying that for me. When he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have food to spare? And here I am starving to death, and I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men.'" Sometimes it takes a lot for us to realize how foolish we've been. It takes a lot to really realize, but he came to his senses and he started to realize how foolish he'd been. He started to get some humility about him. He started to get something that said, "You know what? I need to go home. I need to go home." And so in verse 20, it says, "So he got up and he went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, the father saw him, and filled with compassion for him, he ran to his son and threw his arms around him and kissed him." We're looking at the attributes of God, and this is where we start to see the love of the Father. This is where we start to see his compassion, the love. This is a mirror image of our Father in heaven, and this is where we start to see the love. And you know what? While he was still a long way off, I don't think this was a random event for the Father to actually just look out and see the Son. I don't think he was just doing the dishes and he looked, "Oh, look, there's my son coming back," you know? I think the Father was going out every day, looking, searching, scanning, hoping, praying, believing that his son was going to come back. He wanted it so bad. And one day he went out and he saw his son and he brought him back and he brought him back in. Let's see what happens. So then the son gave him the speech that he prepared, but the father didn't want to hear it. He put the best robe on him. Now, a robe speaks of righteousness in the Bible. He put the best robe on him, and he put a ring on his finger. The ring symbolizes belonging to a family. He put the ring on his finger, and he put sandals on his feet. Can you see the love in the Father's heart for the Son? Can you see the forgiveness of the Father? Can you see the mercy of the Father and the grace? Because not only that, he put on a celebration. He celebrated the fact that his son had come back, because There was no relationship before. Before he left, there was no relationship. And the Father now knew that he had a relationship with his Son.